Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. Welcome back to the Divine Reality course. I hope you're keeping up, inshallah, thus far. Now we're going to move on to the section where we cover why God's existence is self-evidently true. Now, this is a very powerful section, brothers and sisters. And trust me, I can't emphasize this enough. This section, again, will really clarify for us that it's not all about the arguments, especially from an Islamic perspective. Here what we're going to do is that we're going to appreciate why the belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is self-evident, it's basic, it's foundational, it's what we begin with. And it's something that we don't require any proof for, right? So this is not an argument for God's existence. It is about the burden of proof and what is the default position. It will help you and the atheist realize that, number one, atheists carry the burden of proof. Number two, that there are self-evident truths that we all believe to be true, yet do not have evidence for them or cannot argue why they are true. Number three, the Islamic theological position of the self-evident nature of God and the associated concepts of the fitrah is coherent. That's what we're going to be establishing. What we're going to be highlighting is that to believe in God is a foundational self-evident truth. It's not a belief that requires any proof. And self-evident truths, Islam doesn't have a monopoly over them. It's not something we as Muslims are claiming. This is a phenomenon you find in every single sphere of knowledge, every single sphere, right? And we're going to appreciate these things as we go along. And again, it will help us appreciate, brothers and sisters, that when it comes to Allah's existence, belief in Allah, it's not contingent upon an argument, right? Although arguments are there to support this, to awaken the fitrah within people, but fundamentally, the belief in Allah is foundational, is self-evident. And I would even argue it's the greatest self-evident truth there is. And if you have this belief in Allah as your self-evident truth, if anything, it does away for the need for many other self-evident truths that are out there in many ways. But again, we'll appreciate this as we go along. So consider this scenario for a second, this analogy, this thought experiment. Imagine you're sitting at home and you get a call on your phone. And you look at your phone and you see David from your high school. He hasn't called you in years, you haven't met him. Initially you're reluctant in picking the phone up, but you eventually, pick it up and you say hello. And, David's on the other side. He says, how are you? How's things? He said, fine, how are you? And as you're speaking to him, you realize that David seems really excited. He's really energized. Something's happened. And he's really sort of stuttering. He's like, I need to meet up with you. I need to, please meet me at this coffee shop at 12 o'clock this afternoon. And he cuts the phone. And you're thinking, what's going on? So you go over, you meet David, you sit down with him, you order some coffee, and you can tell that David is super excited, he's super energized. And he suddenly looks at you and he's just like, without even asking you anything, he's like, you know what, I've discovered something. I've discovered this amazing thing. And you're like, okay, well, what is it, David, that you've discovered? He turns around and says, I just discovered that the universe, our past, doesn't exist. There is no past. It's just an illusion, and it resets every 5 minutes. So what we're discussing right now, in 5 minutes' time, it doesn't exist, not going to exist. There is no such thing as the past. Now, pause there for a second, and I want you to think about this. What is your response going to be to David? Are you going to think that David has probably just done some drugs this morning, and he's on a trip, and he's losing it? Or are you going to think, wow, David has discovered something phenomenal. This is amazing. Oh my God, how can I prove to him that this is not the case? Which one of the two positions are you going to be in? I assume most of us, hopefully, are going to be in that first position, where we're going to look at him and we're going to think, what type of crack is David on? Literally, what has he been smoking? Now here's the interesting thing. Why is this the case? Why are we going to be in this type of position as opposed to worrying and thinking, oh my God, how do I prove to David that he's wrong? How do I prove to David that the past actually does exist? The reason is because the past existing is an intuitive, basic, self-evident truth. It's something that we believe, something that we recognize, and something that we don't need to prove or establish. It's what we refer to as self-evident. And we don't have to now get worried in that type of scenario and be thinking, okay, how do I prove to David that the past actually does exist? Now, this is a very important analogy for us, especially when it comes to our discussion with atheists. Normally, when we have discourse with atheists, they turn around and they say, prove to me God exists. And they put themselves in this higher position and almost the position of judge, and you're the person that's been that's on trial. God is on trial, essentially, from this perspective. And we're worried and we're thinking, oh my God, okay, I need to prove to him God exists. And you feel this almost that we need to do this, but we don't. Because what I'm positing here, and as we're going to discuss, is the belief in God is self-evident, just like the belief that the past exists. It's foundational. So we shouldn't be in the position where we are obliged to prove the existence of God. No. If anything, they now have to establish why God doesn't exist. So when it comes to basic beliefs, foundational concepts and ideas like this, like the existence of the past, the real world being real, and we look at some examples, these types of beliefs, they can be described as true by default. So related to similar concepts known as axioms, first principles, philosophical assumptions, and foundational truths. Many beliefs are considered to be self-evidently true, brothers and sisters. Many. For example, the uniformity of nature. The belief that the universe is uniform, that it has uniformity, it obeys certain laws. The reality of the past, as we discussed in the example, that the past exists. I mean, you can try to establish this or prove this, but you don't need to. It's self-evident. We assume this intuitively and rationally, the past exists. The validity of our reasoning. You have to start with this assumption that we are rational beings and we have truth-bearing rational faculties. Because if you don't start with this, well, where do you go? You can't go anywhere. I mean, you need to assume you're rational and you have truth-bearing rational faculties, that you have the ability to arrive at truth through these faculties, for you to now engage in any type of discussion and to process anything or to have any knowledge. Because if you don't start with this, if you don't start with the assumption that you're rational, as basic, as foundational, as self-evident, well, where can you go? How can you use your reason to establish your reason? That's checkmate. You can't go anywhere from here. You're finished. Literally. If you don't start with the assumption that you have truth-bearing rational faculties, you're finished. Literally finished. Because how are you going to now establish that your rational faculties are truth-bearing? To do that, you have to use your reason. But if you can't trust your reason, then how can you establish that? It's circular. You can't go anywhere. So truth-bearing rational faculties. The existence of our minds, that our minds exist. You have to begin with these things. Again, it's self-evident that your mind exists and other minds exist out there. The existence of the external world, that the real world is real, that you're sitting in front of your computer right now and that your computer is real, the cup of coffee that you have on the table is real, the table that's in front of me is real, I'm real, you're real. There's no way, and again, think about this, there's no way of establishing this. You can't prove that the real world is real. I mean, try to do that. You may say, oh, I can touch the table, I can smell the coffee, I can see the screen. You can say these things, but how do you know that everything you touch, taste and smell and see isn't just something that you're being stimulated to see and experience? Meaning, how can you prove that you're not a brain in a vat on another planet and aliens are sticking probes into your brain, making you experience everything that you're experiencing? There's no way of disproving that. But you don't believe that because it's self-evident. You start with the assumption that the real world is real. This is integral for science. You cannot have the scientific discipline. You cannot have science. You cannot progress in science unless you start with the axiom, the self-evident truth that the real world is real. Because if you don't believe that, well then what are you going to study? What are you going to study? What are you going to learn about? And there's no way of establishing that or proving that, like we've said already. You also, from a scientific perspective, you have to believe that in the uniformity of nature. You have to believe that the universe is ordered. It follows a certain set of rules and laws, and there's uniformity. How are you going to do that? If you don't start with that assumption, where are you going to go? You can't do science, because science relies on these things. You need to acknowledge a uniform world, and you need to acknowledge that the real world exists. You also need to acknowledge that we have truth-bearing rational faculties. These are all assumptions of science, self-evident truths that we acknowledge as human beings. And it's fine to do that. This is something natural. We have to. Every sphere of knowledge has foundational, self-evident truths that cannot be proven, that do not need to be proven. And you need to begin with them. And if you don't begin with them, you can't build your house of knowledge. They are the foundations, like a building. You have the foundations. If you don't have the foundations laid down, you can't build a house. So this is something we need to understand. The existence of objective moral values. Again, these are self-evident truths. And again, we'll explore this further in the coming sessions. So another point of self-evident truths, they can be wrong. It's not that they necessarily are true. They can be wrong. Self-evident truths are true by default. However, they can be wrong. Self-evident truths are to be accepted until we discover empirically or philosophically that they are false. So the thing with self-evident truths are, they can be wrong. However, you can't just reject them or deny them unless you have empirical or philosophical proof to do so. Right? So this is another key point we need to understand. And I mean, as we've seen, denying self-evident truths, denying our rational, truth-bearing rational faculties, denying the fact that the real world is real, denying the past, denying the uniformity of nature, where is that going to land you? It's going to turn you into a watermelon, literally. There'll be no difference between you and a watermelon that's sitting on a shelf. Because you can't move, you can't do anything. And as human beings, we need to move. Like I said, we can't do science. You wouldn't have the scientific discipline if you didn't have these self-evident foundational truths. So they are integral to any inquiry, any aspect of knowledge. They are integral. So the onus of proof, let's talk about this. When someone questions these truths, we do not blindly accept their conclusions, right? Number one, usually we should reply with, what evidence do you have to reject these self-evident truths? Now go back to the scenario of David for a second. David was challenging or denying a self-evident truth, that the past exists. Now we didn't just blindly accept it, and it will be wrong to do so. You will be as crazy as David in that scenario if you were to do so. What we should say in these cases, what evidence you have to reject this self-evident truth. The onus of proof is on you, not on us. So, brothers and sisters, before we move on, I know this is a new concept, and again, I can understand and appreciate why this may be a difficult concept for us to grasp, because through education, as we grow, we're taught seeing is believing. You need evidence for everything, especially empirical evidence for things to believe in them. Right? This is the type of mentality and psychology that's developed through just growing through the world that we live in today. So coming to terms with self-evident truths and concepts, or just this whole concept and idea in and of itself, may be something new to us, but it's something that we need to really appreciate and understand. And hopefully we've seen the strength of self-evident truths and how important they are to even disciplines such as science that the world relies on today. Right? So really try to conceptualize this and understand this, and when you're ready, move on to the next section.